Wow, what a week. We saw some specs hit record DPS highs, then the beta shut down for a few days, then World vs. World got haunted. It was a pretty eventful week for the game, to be honest. Joking aside, I really think this was a super interesting beta. I think most players had a ton of fun with it. Lots of fun new ideas, fun new builds, and it's always funny to play with builds pushing DPS ceilings that aren't going to last longer than the week. But let's take a step back, away from the bugs, the absurd DPS, and the fact that this is ultimately a work in progress, so we can take a look at the big picture. If ANET fixed every bug and shipped these Elite Specializations as is, how would each of them measure up? Yes, this is a tier list video. To be clear, this isn't me grading the quality of the work previewed in the beta. ANET is some of the best in the business, and I'm just one person with opinions on the internet. This is, however, me trying to evaluate how these designs best serve their class, the fantasy promised by the specialization, and how well they achieve those core designs in the game itself. If you want more information on what I think makes for a good or bad Elite Specialization, I posted a video last week about that exact topic. This is, however, me tricking you into watching a video on game design analysis for a 13-year-old MMO because I put letters next to each of the new Elite Specialization icons. Hey, it's too late now. You're already emotionally invested in my opinion because I said it was a tier list video, so let's go ahead and get started. Luminary is a very simple spec, but that fantasy has a wide audience. Guardian is, after all, the most popular class on websites like Guild Wars 2 Efficiency, so it makes a ton of sense to have a class that's identifiably and specifically Guardian. But even with that as a core tenet of its design, Luminary feels somewhat lacking and unsuccessful as a core plus specialization. I do think that there's value in keeping core virtues and giving them a home inside of an elite spec, even if players have been saying that they're lacking in complexity. The problem with complexity is absolutely solvable even without touching virtues themselves. Just give players more reasons to engage with those core virtues. There's a bit of an axiom in game design circles, courtesy of Mark Rosewater, the lead designer of Magic the Gathering, that your audience is good at recognizing problems and bad at solving them, and I think this is a great example of that actually. People are absolutely correct that virtues aren't doing enough for Luminary, but by instead giving those virtues more interesting and engaging interactions with both Radiant Shroud and the tools within it, that would transform them from something basic and simple to a mechanic worth considering every time you touch a virtue. I do love the fact that there's two genuinely powerful DPS stances though. Power Guardian has brought Sword of Justice, Bane Signet, and an elite spec skill for as long as I can remember, so being able to replace Sword of Justice helps distinguish itself meaningfully from Power Dragon Hunter and Power Willbender. But unfortunately, stances aren't great for heal Luminary, at least not anymore. ANET removed shimmering stances before the beta started, so protection uptime now needs to be managed by Hold the Line, a skill brought exclusively to maintain that protection, something most other healers get to provide for free just by managing the rotation. Might is similarly scuffed for the build. Using additional weapon skills inside of Radiant Shroud would prolong the cooldown when you leave, so if you use anything other than Shining Hammer, your might immediately lapses without outside help. Higher saturation might and actual passive protection access would go a long way towards making Heal Luminary both more comfortable to play and able to actually use Shroud dynamically to react to encounters. This does highlight a larger problem with Shroud. Being punished for using your unique tool in clever ways puts a pressure on the player to not engage with it any more than they absolutely have to, which doesn't help the spec distinguish itself. A more engaging Shroud would help different versions of the spec maintain a unique texture from one another too, and I hope that this is something ANET has their eye on. There's a number of solutions here, but ultimately, I think there needs to be some defining feedback loop where weapons in Shroud reward you for using virtues, and the virtues reward you for using Shroud weapons. Otherwise, I'm worried the spec will feel largely disjointed. Longtime Guardian players that love the core fantasy of the class and just want more of it are pretty likely to be satisfied here, but between the fact that its Shroud gameplay loop is flat, not to mention that it behaves less like a Shroud and more like a Forge, ANET, just call it Radiant Forge, it's much more similar to Hollowsmith Hollowforge than any Shroud currently in the game, and you literally forge weapons out of light and flame. But its support boon uptime is pretty lacking, and its current design is overly familiar to existing Guardian players, so I'm hard-pressed to give this any higher than a C tier. As I covered in my speculation video, Paragon has a ton of raw potential. Unfortunately, also as I'd predicted, it has very little practical use, and it doesn't leverage the good bones it's built on. A dedicated, definitive heal spec for Warrior is excellent and has been a long time coming, and while Berserker is successful at this role, there's still value in giving the class an elite specialization to signpost that it's more than capable as a healer. Broadly, Heal Alacrity Paragon has all the tools it needs to succeed. Good boon output, solid CC, flexible utility skills, genuinely great healing, and plenty more. But all of this is coming from core Warrior, tools ANET granted the class to support Heal Berserker, but it's turned into a curse for Paragon because it's hard to compete with such potent core offerings. Ultimately, Paragon's hampered by a lack of unique value typically brought by the heal archetype. Its utility skills are worse versions of those core Warrior has, and while its elite skill is good, Paragon still has no notable CC, no movement skills like Shadow Steps or Portals, No projectile mitigation, no invuln, no group invisibility, or other useful tools that boon classes generally like to have in their toolkit. That's not to say that Paragon needs all of these traits, or any of them really, it just serves to illustrate the fact that even as a heal build, it doesn't compete on specifically strong utility access that often defines how fights are solved in in-game PvE. Chants also aren't well realized as they currently exist. Paragon wants to blow its chants almost entirely off cooldown exclusively for Alacrity. This would be like Firebrand needing to open and immediately close Tome of Courage to generate enough quickness. The utility of that kit is best saved for deliberate use, so tapping into it when it's not needed is wasteful. Burning your supportive skills just to apply your primary boon just feels bad, especially on a heal build, and it turns gameplay from an interactive experience into one that amounts to playing just a very slow rhythm game. Motivation isn't sufficiently leveraged across Paragon's kit either, so it feels generally unsupported, and its presence just serves to make the elite spec extremely adrenaline hungry. Chance could directly cost motivation rather than cost motivation to upkeep, which would make the resource a bit more flexible for the class on the whole. Not only does this restrict the utility of Heal Paragon, it gives DPS Paragon builds an even further mountain to climb if they want to legitimize themselves. For context, DPS Paragon is less potent than Core Warrior on account of the fact that it restricts access to level 3 bursts, and it only has one paltry damage modifier within the entire trait line. Some support for both condition and power would go a long way. Paragon is an obvious opportunity to have more than one long-forgotten condition build, and power is an obvious option for the specialization on account of the fact that Spear is one of the most identifiable parts of Paragon in the first place. Despite Paragon having tremendous potential, the reality is, at the time of the Visions of Eternity beta, that potential just has not been tapped into. It has arguably better bones than most of the other elite specs though. It has unique profession skills, a specific resource traits and skills can key into to create interesting gameplay decisions, and the way commands and chants interact with one another is legitimately super cool, but it needs to actually use those systems and provide more value to be worth its presence and come into its own identity. Unfortunately, for that reason, that places Paragon, at least in its current state, dead last in F tier. Conduit kinda exists in a strange spot. While the build was fun for those that sank their teeth into it, a lot of those same players mentioned it played a lot like Conduit Renegade. It also fell completely flat as a power build both in terms of performance and in terms of its play pattern. It is wonderful that existing Conduit Renegade players felt at home on Conduit and enjoyed their time with it, even though Mistfire was bugged so they couldn't fully test it. At best, it'll end up with 3 valid builds, and that assumes a lot of work put into Power Conduit too. This spec having 2 unique condition builds potentially is cool, but with Power Conduit completely exposing fundamental issues with PvE Power Revenant, not to mention Jalis and Ventari being asked to sit this one out, it's hard to look at this spec and not think there's a lot more that could have been delivered on. Affinity being a somewhat orphaned mechanic ties into this as well. While Affinity does inform your rotation, the optimal play patterns aren't making decisions with respect to Affinity frequently enough for it to really affect the way the spec plays. Catalyst has had this same problem with energy for years where, in PvE at least, it feels like a cost of doing business rather than an influencing factor in how you structure your play. I also find it somewhat concerning that constantly flipping upkeep skills repeatedly does build Affinity, which has the potential to create some really toxic play patterns in the future, and that's an interaction worth looking at, but Affinity overall likely needs reevaluation to feel like a more cohesive part of what Conduit wants to be doing. I want to take some time to dig into Power Conduit though, because it's kind of an interesting case study. Power Revenant has it rough. Vindicator is an exceptionally good build, yes, but it's due to no shortage of under-the-table help to facilitate that build specifically. It gets a massive damage coefficient and its enhanced dodge to help fill what would otherwise be rotation downtime, on top of the fact that it's basically sitting pretty on a perpetual plus 35% damage modifier. Even Power Herald has plus 20% from Reinforced Potency and Draconic Echo, and that's still not enough to keep up with Vindicator. Despite creating some legitimately interesting optimization and buildcraft opportunities, the raw stats Power Conduit has doesn't even compare to an already very weak Power Herald. It does theoretically have Twin Moon Sweep and Beguiling Haze to fill parts of its rotation that would otherwise be rather low damage, but given these skills are extremely weak and, in Beguiling Haze's case, very clunky, it's not looking too great. Beguiling Haze in particular probably needs its cast time brought down pretty significantly too. While I'm sensitive to the needs of PvP players, it's so slow and so clunky in its current state that it's bordering on egregious. The way it feels right now just is not it. Power Conduit needs some source of strike damage modifiers in its kit to succeed as a power build, as well as a lot of attention towards the performance and game feel of the utility skills it's expected to use frequently. Finally, there's the elephant in the room of the fact that even if Power Conduit were good, there's still only 2 legends that the spec gets access to. Evoker actually gives us an interesting paradigm to draw from to fix this problem though. Alacrity and/or quickness could be tied to either of the respective resonance effects for Chalice or Ventari, or of their associated Cosmic Wisdom bonuses. This would help justify the available synergies pretty dramatically without giving either of the premier damage options access to these cornerstone boons. Regardless of the solution, I think something needs to be done here, because the spec doesn't have enough internal variety to be this narrow, so it reads like a missed opportunity. This is unfortunately a D-tier spec for now. Antiquary is, unequivocally, the most polarizing of the new Elite Specializations. That much is for sure. I do want to state up top, I am empathetic towards the players that wanted something else with Antiquary and didn't get it. The spec isn't for you, it's not for me either, and I get how that can be disappointing. But it's hard to say that the things it's doing in a mechanical sense aren't extremely interesting. A purely random specialization is new territory for this game, and it needs to be said, ANET kinda crushed it in how they balanced its overall performance. The low roll benches for Condition Antiquary are hitting about 42,000 DPS, with the high roll benches hitting 47,000 and a theoretical ceiling of 50k, and that whole range maps pretty closely to what people have come to expect from builds in PvE these days. It could probably stand to be brought down a little bit, but honestly, that's kind of incredible. I really do think ANET deserves praise for that because the spec almost seemed like an unsolvable problem. There's also something to be said for the fact that we now, finally, have a Condition Thief build that can self-supply fields that it can whirl with Death Blossom. This gives the build a really unique texture. For those unaware, combo fields that result in damaging conditions have been massively impactful for Thief for a long time. For example, if you have one heal chrono spacing out their wells to help support the condition Daredevil specifically, that can contribute as much as 4,500 DPS on some fights. It's extremely impactful. It's really cool that ANET gave Thief players the ability to take that into their own hands now. The negatives start to emerge from the fact that it's hard to justify engaging with that RNG in the first place, though. Like, yes, it's fun for a subset of players, and that has implicit value, but what do they gain from managing that RNG? Both Power and Conduit Antiquary are much less durable on account of the self-damage from backfires on Stone Summit Cannon, basically mandating a ton of healing. On top of the fact that in Power's case, additionally from Unstable Script Bomb, you need over 100% stability uptime to compensate for its knockdown. That's a ton of inconvenience, and your reward is an identical damage profile and comparable average performance to Power or Condition Daredevil respectively. It just doesn't really make sense. There really needs to be some reward for engaging with the RNG inherent to Antiquary. Strong self-boon generation, baked-in durability, good personal healing, and a better suite of utility artifacts, anything would help. While some number of pain points are worth keeping to preserve that high-risk, high-reward playstyle, there do need to be rewards for engaging with that playstyle in the first place. One way to fix this could be improving the general utility of the artifacts to solve problems that might emerge in content. As it stands, artifacts like Chalk Shield and Exalted Hammer aren't just DPS negative, which is fine for an RNG spec, they're not all going to have the same damage value. They're also just not particularly useful in the situations they seem to be designed for. The RNG of Antiquary gets a lot more interesting the more you as a player can find problems to solve with the random resources you get. But all of that ignores the fact that there's just too many sources of artifacts for you to be able to use them all. Often, you'll be left literally unable to find circumstances for the ones you even want to use, and those risk being stripped away by a trigger of Prodigious Pincher or just the inopportune timing of a trigger on Grit Scuffle. It just feels really bad to be given a glut of resources and have no way to use them, especially when the cast times for all of the artifacts are so variable, and the ones you actually plan to use might get taken away from you right as you're going to use them. This results in a spec flush with artifacts it's unable to spend completely, and many of those it won't be able to find a use for even through clever and considered play. Unfortunately, this results in yet one more Thief spec whose primary value is exclusively damage. I don't think this spec can be buffed to define the damage ceiling the same way specs like Deadeye, Bladesworn, Willbender, Weaver, and company can. It's bad precedent if the highest source of achievable damage in endgame content is that of a particular elite specialization getting extremely lucky. Antiquary, consequently, needs to provide access to an abundance of utility or it runs the risk of being completely unjustifiable in endgame content at all. Ultimately, the pieces are all there, and it's just a matter of delicate tuning at this point. So, while the spec does need work, it's quite close to achieving the goals it sets out to. As a result, I'm going to be placing it in B tier. Gailshot revisiting the same design tenets of Deadeye, that being keying into the identity of a long-distance fighter in a game that often punishes anything other than tight stacking, was pretty ambitious. Given the way Guild Wars 2's boon system works, leaving aside the myriad other practical reasons why having a squad grouped up is beneficial, realizing the fantasy of a truly ranged class that's both fun and effective is a difficult thing to pull off. Hell, it took Deadeye years to get that right. The existing framework of the game seems stacked against Gailshot in that regard, but I'm extremely impressed. In terms of both adhering to the intended design fantasy and creating a viable, unique elite specialization, ANET did an amazing job here. For clarity, we still don't have a ranged spec on our hands here that can stand off in Narnia and perform competitively, but this is more about how Gailshot feels in terms of both its design space and in leveraging a gameplay component that's largely been just flavor: projectiles. The identity of an elite spec that completely leverages projectiles fits very naturally into the archetype of a fighter using a bow, and Gailshot delivers on that fantasy completely. Mistral alone makes this spec a really fascinating buildcraft puzzle, and a lot of the texture of Gailshot emerges from how it tries to maximize that skill. Another thing that gives Gailshot its own place with its sibling specs is that it doesn't need to bring traps to serve in its role as a power DPS. Quick DPS Gailshot is quite strong too, and it maintains value relative to Untamed in that it trades utility and flexibility for raw damage. That's a great paradigm to follow when you have two specializations that share in their primary output. Unfortunately, it's kind of impossible to talk about a ranged ranger build without discussing the sore spot Gailshot highlights most prominently: Longbow. While not inherently the fault of Gailshot, at time of the Visions of Eternity beta, Longbow is a very clunky and outdated weapon. While Gailshot does bring Longbow, it is exclusively for rapid fires projectiles and nothing else. Having Longbow be good for exactly one thing on the spec promising an archer fantasy is a bit of a strange choice. Just because Gailshot was given a fancy new magical bow doesn't mean that the old longbow that players have already come to love and grow accustomed to doesn't deserve a bit of attention as well. Gailshot also has the detriment of fetch preventing it from using pets for fight utility, as it's a damage loss to not take a pair of whatever the best performing pet at any given moment is. This puts it at a disadvantage relative to Untamed, since Gailshot's pet swap is used exclusively to fetch arrows and reload, not for anything like Clarion Bond boons, or even access to the alternate pet's F2 skill. Not to take away from the successes of Gailshot though, Gailbow is a very fun weapon bundle. Mistral is also a very fun skill too, though it does suffer from a bit of placement jank. This shows up most obviously on prop bosses like Harvest Temple, where the stack point tends to be within their hitbox. If a hit registers before a skill passes through Mistral, it doesn't benefit from the additional damage, which leads to the spec being uncomfortable in ways it doesn't really need to be. While it has its fair share of pain points, Aina executed phenomenally well here, and with a few extra changes to its tools into Longbow, I see this spec being an incredibly popular one for years to come. It's an easy S tier. Amalgam came out of the gate very strong. I think it was the most interesting elite specialization after all the preview streams had wrapped up, and the player base at large seemed extremely excited to give it their attention going into the beta. And boy did it demand that attention. With initial burst cresting 100,000 DPS, for those less familiar, that's its damage once the training golem lost 20% of its health. That's unheard of. That won't last though, so I'm not going to waste much time on it. And given that the performance comes from the fact that 44% of its damage comes from the 3 offensive protocol skills in Shred, Pierce, and Obliterate, it's an easy fix. Not to let Power Amalgam steal all of the spotlight, Condition Amalgam is also extremely strong. It's a very hard build, but that's not new to Engineer, and even with that knowledge, it's a unique build that absolutely justifies its presence. It's extremely flexible, strong, and it has room for simpler and far more complex builds, which is exactly what a spec like it should set out to accomplish. It bears mentioning that the toolbelt skills being as performant as they are makes the idea of adapting those slots to solve problems on a given fight really tricky for the spec in its current state. Even if the damage of these skills were cut completely in half, they'd still be 3 of Power Amalgam's 5 best skills. This makes the opportunity cost of replacing them with unique utility that defines Amalgam a really difficult proposition. Not to mention the fact that structurally, it's pretty similar to Scrapper, but it's better in most ways that matter. Finding ways to distinguish the two specs from each other would go a long way. Scrapper had a much more distinct feel when Hammer was helping elevate its identity, but now that Amalgam has joined the party as yet another Hammer build, a lot of that texture gets eroded away. That's fine if Amalgam does more to distinguish its gameplay loop, or its decision-making, either in content or in the build panel, but as it stands, it's largely showed up to take the spotlight from Scrapper while not putting more of a unique spin on things. For instance, Mercurial Tendencies has direct and meaningful synergy with Offhand Shield, and given that Offhand Shield and its preferred partner in Sword still isn't providing enough to the build that should theoretically be its most natural home, it's kind of disappointing that Offhand Shield doesn't have a home in PvE on non-heal engineer builds. I don't want to seem like I'm ragging on Amalgam completely. The spec is successful, the flavor is amazing, the animations are extremely fun and cool, and the fact that it's similar to Scrapper doesn't mean it's not fun. People love Scrapper, but it does mean that there's room to push harder on the ideas promised by the spec. An adaptable build that rewards you for leveraging parts of your kit in clever ways on a fight-by-fight basis, all because your symbiotic mold gives you the ability to adjust in ways no other engineer could. This spec is legitimately successful, it just needs to push a touch harder to really reach the heights it's inches away from achieving. And because of that, I'm putting it in A tier. Behold, a fire wizard. Honestly, I think other than probably Weaver, Evoker has the strongest fantasy of all of the Elementalist elite specializations, and that alone is worth celebrating. It's also delivered extremely well on that fantasy too. Specialized elements builds, well, build, we'll get back to that, have been very successful, and importantly, they cover a very wide gamut of difficulties. From pretty standard Inferno and true Conduit fire-centered specialized elements builds, to faster and more frenetic air power and power quickness builds, to the absolutely insane pure condition Evoker with Pistol Warhorn, there's a huge variety of play experiences the spec offers for DPS players. That's huge, considering Elementalist is in the difficult position of appealing to lots of newer, less enfranchised players, and some of the most in-the-weeds optimizer types in the game. And all of these builds feel meaningfully different to pilot too, so it doesn't feel like any of those player bases is sacrificing much. Though, that unfortunately highlights the fact that specialized elements, arguably the cornerstone trait of Evoker in the first place for a lot of people, only has one element worth specializing in: fire. Air sacrifices far too much when it can't aggressively leverage fire's high power coefficients. Water has 0 boons, and Earth barely has any reason to exist in PvE without it caring about other conditions. Even then it would be an uphill battle. At least Water Evoker practically doesn't care about specialized elements, since it wants access to the Alacrity of Familiar's Blessing, but even with that, there's the issue of boon access being pretty bad. Other Elementalist healers have access to lots of boons from their Elite spec offerings to help manage this, but Heal Evoker really pulls back the curtain on how pitiful core Elementalists' support utilities are. The issues with specialized elements aren't a problem in the sense that Evoker is lacking for options, it most certainly is not, but it's more a problem in that it promises a lot to Elementalist players and is only able to deliver on the specialization fantasy for only one of the 4 elements. Not to mention that the tension between balancing for builds like air specialized elements and fire specialized elements is tricky though, because fire is performing extremely well and air is struggling to keep pace, which then makes it difficult to provide support to the air variant when fire is using all of the same tools to perform exceptionally well. It's a very tricky balancing act. Ultimately, I do think Evoker is super successful. It's clearly a popular archetype, and it's delivering in about as many ways as I can think can be reasonably hoped for from a beta. There is a bit of a concern that the familiar and empowered familiar skills are doing a disproportionate amount for any given build, but that's a balance problem likely to get fixed after the beta. I hope more specialized elements find a home. I hope Heal Evoker gets direct support because it's super unique, and it not having a home is pretty immediately frustrating when that's part of the core fantasy the spec is promising, but all in all, it's doing a great job at delivering what it sets out to for a very large variety of players. In spite of where it fell short in the beta, it has so much going on that to think it could ever deliver on everything this early is absurd, so as a result, Evoker is A tier. Coming into the beta, Ritualist was something I was really excited for, and it does some things extremely well. It's one of the best looking Elite specs out of the bunch, for example, but there's quite a few things that give me a bit of pause. While their damage during the beta was quite low, DPS Ritualist and Quick DPS Ritualist do at least have different Grandmaster traits, and as a result, they're builds that feel unique from both each other and from Necro's other offerings. The issues start to arise from how each build is expected to interact with the spirits, and as a result, the general fantasy of the spec ends up falling somewhat flat. Not to mention that the current state of spirits feels very much like core Mesmer, so the Ritualist gameplay loop feels overly familiar. While that gameplay is unique for Necro specifically, in practice, the interactions with spirits are pretty surface level. DPS Ritualist spends very little time interacting with its spirits beyond summoning them. Heal Ritualist summons and ruptures them immediately to sustain boons, and Quick DPS Ritualist, despite using them more, still doesn't get to use them much. The gameplay loop of Rit ought to care more about your spirits and interacting with them to really deliver on the fantasy it promises. For instance, Heal Ritualist is actively punished for keeping spirits alive, since not rupturing them immediately makes for poor boon uptime. Instead, maybe F2 through F4 could become your spirit's summon skills, while the Shroud skills could interact with their corresponding spirit, so you get to use them more frequently. I know a stated concern for Ritualists was spirits not feeling interactive in a PvP context, which is why you do need to commit a trait to lingering spirits if you want that behavior, but that's a problem that could be solved by causing the Ritualist spirits to die if the player gets CC'd. Then, there's an avenue for interaction while making the spec maintain a more proactive spirit-centered gameplay loop, just as an example. PvP design isn't my primary concern, but when PvP-centered design stands in the way of a more evocative and resonant version of an Elite specialization, it's worth considering ways to push into more novel creative spaces, while still understanding that these modes have special considerations that need to be made for them. Looking into Ritualist's builds in a more practical sense, first and foremost, Heal Ritualist is very well realized. There's a bit of concern with the fact that the spec's might comes from Anguish and Rupture Anguish, and since those are all sources of 8 might, the spec needs to bring a relic like Midnight King in order to provide one singular might. This is extremely fixable by making Rupture grant 10 might instead of 8, but it's also a relatively minor issue. The bigger issue, I think, is the fact that its protection, a proactive job of any healer, is tied to the class's biggest heals, which are all designed to be reactive. Increasing the quantity of protection provided by Wanderlust would help balance out the distribution of boons and heals across the kit. Additionally, Zinray's weapon ends up feeling like more trouble than it's worth when you can just bring Flesh Golem to provide CC. Zinray's weapon likely needs to be either on a much shorter cooldown, or much easier to leverage deliberately into the attacks and mechanics it's designed to answer. Despite Heal Ritualist's success though, DPS builds are worrisome. Not in terms of their performance in beta necessarily, but in terms of how they'd continue to exist if they moved forward in their current state. It's pretty well known that in Guild Wars 2, power builds do their damage immediately, and condition builds ramp up over time. Condition builds often bench higher than power builds, but power builds thrive on shorter or more phased fights. This tension keeps both build types generally valuable in endgame content. Enter Ritualist, the unfortunate power build burdened with actual substantial damage ramp. Theoretically, this isn't a problem if the numbers were up to par, but even if this ends up being the case, this places Power Ritualist in a similar role to other Power Necromancers, as they also lack burst. There is a way to fix both of these problems though. Buff explosive growth. By rewarding Ritualists for generating summons immediately at the top of their rotation, a more powerful explosive growth would serve to, at least, provide lots of damage at the very start of the rotation to normalize the initial ramp, and if pushed sufficiently far, potentially give Necromancer a power DPS option with some degree of burst. I do also think there's something to be said for the fact that Ritualist has anti-synergy with the best Power Necromancer trait line, Soul Reaping, and that it doesn't get to maximize value out of Death Perception when it doesn't have any interest in staying in Shroud. It also has to contend with the fact that it has barely any synergy with Death Magic either, the trait line that directly cares about summoning things. For Death Magic to be viable, it would likely need to coincide with a reimagining of a lot of what the trait line is trying to do, and a lot of buffs. Some combination of changing the trait line from referencing minions to creatures, like Ritualist does, changing toughness to vitality and providing a stat conversion, letting creatures inherit some amount of the Necromancer's stats to increase their own power, or any number of other minor tweaks, but no direct synergy here does feel like a missed opportunity. Lastly, there's a bit of a quiet concern that summoned spirits have a tendency to make playing Ritualist feel somewhat claustrophobic. With Mesmer, clones exist around your target and don't occupy your immediate space, but when you can summon meaningfully larger allies to your exact position while in Shroud, it ends up contributing to a lot of visual noise. Spreading these positions of the spirits would go a long way towards making the builds feel less smothering. That would have the knock-on effect of really highlighting the fact that spirit targeting logic can be kind of iffy, but this could also be fixed by making the range of the spirit's attack larger than their take target range. All in all, there's a lot to love with Ritualist. It's unique, it's gorgeous, it's interesting, it has fun skills, and it's a really genuinely successful Necromancer healer. But there's a lot holding it back too. Its gameplay identity is unique to Necro, but overly familiar to Guild Wars 2 on the whole. Its spirit interactions are lacking, its Shroud is extremely weak, and its performance, even if the numbers were there, is anti-synergistic with the kinds of content that prefer power builds in the first place. It doesn't need an overhaul per se, but it does need some time in the oven still, and for that reason, I'm going to put it in C tier. Going into any given beta, I think people expect most things to be some degree of unfinished, but from its polish, to its theming, to its animations, to its sounds, and everything in between, Troubadour is just incredible. Obviously, not every spec can be this finalized during a beta, but I'm shocked and incredibly pleased with how realized Troubadour was here. It has a specific gameplay identity, strong build variety, a powerful suite of utility, and more than just the standard suite of power Mesmer weapon configurations. Namely, one of the weapon configurations people had been testing for Power Troubadour, at least for some fights, is Spear coupled with Dagger and Shield. That's extremely cool, and I think that kind of unique weapon texture is something legitimately so compelling that it's worth focusing design effort into explicitly supporting. More so than most specializations, both in past betas and this one, I think you could drop Troubadour as is into Guild Wars 2 literally right now and it would fit perfectly. If I really squint and narrow my focus, there are 3 primary points of attention I think are worth diving into. Firstly, this spec is punishing. Casting an instrument will keep the highest duration buff, rather than stacking durations, so say if you have 7 seconds remaining on your loot buff and you want to add to that duration by casting a 0-note F1, instead of gaining the 5 seconds a 0-note loot would give you, nothing changes. As a result, playing in a way that sustains your buff over the course of a fight is really tight. It's a lot like old school Power Berserker as a result actually. Like Power Berserker, it likely needs numbers tweaking to allow it to have a bit of a grace period where you aren't immediately punished for slight lapses in your personal buff management. This also has the benefit of helping Power Alacrity builds stack their personal buff and consequently Alacrity duration, which would meaningfully smooth out the build's rotation. Next is the inevitable comparison between Heal Troubadour and Heal Chronomancer. Troubadour has lots of potent offerings, but ultimately Chronos might make it a better healer still. Between Continuum Shift, improved Alacrity, its glut of CC, and how potent Wells generally are, Troubadour, while a reasonable healer in its own right, doesn't really supplant Chronomancer in this role. Distortion Share on Tale of the August Queen does help, but it's also something that's so powerful that it's not likely to stick around long term, so without that, it's hard to imagine playing the spec over Chronomancer if you need to heal Mesmer. This is fixable, and ultimately difficult to evaluate without seeing the full scope of changes coming to Chronomancer, but it bears mentioning nonetheless. Lastly is that without using Tale of the August Queen at the very start of its rotation, Troubadour takes some time to get rolling, which leaves it in the unenviable position of being a ramping power DPS build to get all of its stat buffs active. This is probably fine, given that it's reasonable to attach an opportunity cost to saving Tale of the August Queen for reactive play rather than proactive buff management, but I did want to mention it because it puts a pressure on the build that could make it less compelling than Power Chrono, Virtuoso, or Power Mirage whenever that build gets a bit more support. All in all, those complaints are extremely minor, and Troubadour succeeds pretty much completely at everything it sets out to do. I'm incredibly impressed, and I think a lot of the excitement around this spec in particular is testament to just how much of a slam dunk it is, from design to execution to its playstyle. It's not without its pain points, but this is a beta after all, and even in that context, they're extraordinarily minor. ArenaNet has made something really special here. S tier. And with that done, let's go over our tier list one last time. In F tier is Paragon, a build presently offering nothing unique to Core Warrior's toolkit as a healer, and in a lot of cases doesn't even compare with Berserker in that role, an elite spec with precious few support tools to its name. In D tier we have Conduit, a build spreading itself too thin through its interactions with every Revenant legend when only one of those legends is worth using. In C tier we have Luminary, a functional and straightforward Guardian specialization with a relatively indistinct gameplay loop as a DPS and lack of basic healing tools. And Ritualist, a Necromancer with good bones and a solid heal build, but lacking in specific texture or justification as a damage dealer. In B tier we have Antiquary, a spec with a very well-executed core fantasy, marred largely by an inability to stand out above its siblings, and a glut of gameplay discomforts it doesn't make up for anywhere. In A tier we have Amalgam, a relatively straightforward but extremely evocative engineer spec that only honestly falls short because its performance ceiling was so high that it's hard to justify getting cute with its flexibility to help solve encounters. And Evoker, a spec that promised the world to Elementalist players and was only able to give them a small island, one the healers and the Earth Toad weren't invited to. In S tier we have Troubadour, an extremely successful spec from top to bottom whose only real issue is that it was perhaps a bit punishing to play, and Gailshot, a tremendously successful take on the core Ranger fantasy, stained ever so slightly by being encouraged to bring Longbow despite not actually finding all that much to do with it. And that does it for our tier list. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was a fun watch and somewhat educational as well. Maybe you missed out on the beta, maybe you didn't know what was going on with an elite spec that you kept hearing people talk about, but all the same, I appreciate your time and I hope you have a wonderful day.